Good afternoon and welcome to Fuqua's LinkedIn Live series, where Fuqua experts will answer your questions about the effects that the coronavirus pandemic is having on business and the global economy. My name is David Robinson. I'm the James and Gail Vandervelde Professor of Finance at Fuqua. My research focuses on entrepreneurship, household finance, and private equity. The novel coronavirus is having a major impact on our economy through a wide variety of channels. Today, I'm going to focus on entrepreneurship and household finance. I'm going to try to talk about what we can expect going forward, especially in light of the recently passed stimulus package. In a few minutes, I'll be taking questions, so if you have questions, go ahead and send them onward and I'll try my best to answer them as our time unfolds. A lot of economists and politicians are telling us to expect a U-shaped or V-shaped rebound. In other words, a rapid bounce back to offset the major contraction that we've experienced, a bounce back that would bring us back more or less to the level where we were before things started. I disagree with this assessment. I think this pandemic is going to cause a continued drag on the economy long after it is safe to travel, long after life sort of returns to life as normal. There are a couple of reasons why I don't see a V-shaped rebound. First, let's look at the small business side. Here, as you may have heard, this recently passed stimulus package calls for about $350 billion to be made available for loans to small businesses as part of a payroll protection plan. These loans are basically designed to encourage small businesses to retain their employees during this economic crunch. The details are literally being ironed out as we speak, but as far as I can tell, it looks like these loans are going to be run through the 7A program that the Small Business Administration runs. My best guess is then that that means that if you're a small business and you want to access these funds, you want to work with your existing banking relationships in order to apply for these loans. Secretary Mnuchin has promised a loan approval process that is dramatically less onerous than that of a typical 7A loan. But even still, this money is likely several weeks away. Banks are going to be inundated with phone calls, and I cannot stress that enough. To give you a sense of the order of magnitude you want to think about here, bear in mind that we had 3.3 million jobless claims filed last week. My colleague Cam Harvey, who's going to speak to us in our series next week, has calculated this to be a 167 standard deviation increase in jobless claims. So take that and walk that over to the small business sector, and you're going to see banks just jammed with requests for these loans. In fact, I spoke to someone this morning with the Small Business Investor Alliance. He thinks that we could burn through this $350 billion in maybe 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks at the outside. To see why that's not unreasonable, understand the magnitude of the small business sector. It's hard to get a precise number of exactly how many small businesses there are in the U.S., but if you look at census data, it tells you that there's about 5.6 million businesses. More than half of these have fewer than 5 employees. Around 50% of total employment is in firms that have 500 employees or fewer. Another way to look at this $350 billion number is that if you take quarterly payroll for all firms with fewer than 500 employees, that amounts to about $600 billion. So on the small business side, this is actually not a large stimulus relative to the size of the problem. And while these loans will have forgiveness built into them, they're going to have to be paid back. Going forward, that means that small businesses are going to have a tighter belt than they might otherwise have. And this debt overhang is going to affect investment. I think that's one reason why we're not going to experience a V-shaped recession like many are predicting. Second, let's switch gears and go from the small business sector to sort of the household sector. And let's look at the current stimulus plan and see it for what it is and what it isn't. If you go back and think about the financial crisis, think about President Bush passing a tax relief plan that sent money to households in the form of tax rebates. Think back to that plan, or maybe think to President Obama's Cash for Clunkers plan, which was designed to stimulate automobile purchases. In each of those cases, the idea behind the plan was to put money into households' hands to give them an incentive to spend, hoping that that boosts consumption, pulling the economy out of a deflationary spiral. That's not what we're talking about here. This package is aimed at preventing a short-term liquidity problem for households becoming a long-term solvency problem. In other words, households have to make rent and other expenses over the next few months, but they face highly uncertain income. And the question is, how do we keep them out of bankruptcy until the economy bounces back? So this isn't a stimulus at all. It's a lifeline. It's a bailout. You've probably all seen the details for households. It's basically $1,200 a person, $500 a child, up to around $75,000 a year in annual income, then scaling back from there. And so, the immediate question you want to ask is this enough? Is this a lot? Is this a little? What kind of an impact is this likely to have? So to put that number into perspective, bear in mind that the median household earns about $65,000 a year, or about $5,400 a month. That means that a family of four at the median is going to be receiving a check that is about a little less than, say, 1 month's after-tax take-home pay, depending on the state you live in and kind of your household structure. So maybe let's think 3 weeks. So now take that 3-week check and pit it against the financial fragility that most households face. So an organization called FINRA, which is sort of a self-policing regulatory body for securities markets, they have a foundation, and that foundation puts out something called the National Financial Capability Study. That study allows us to get a picture of what households look like at different income levels. If you look at median income households, around 40% of them, around 40% of these households work in situations where their monthly income varies either somewhat or a great deal from 1 month to the next. So that means that nearly half of median income households are facing income volatility and can expect to experience disruptions in their income going forward. Around 40% of them say that they have trouble paying their bills each month. Around half carry credit card balances. Around a quarter couldn't come up with $2,000 in the next 3 months if they needed to. So when you take a look at that picture, you consider these facts, 3 weeks of after-tax income is not that much money, especially balanced against the likely duration of the economic disruption we're going to experience. And so, a lot of median income families who are living more or less paycheck to paycheck, carrying credit card balances forward, are going to find their belts tighter, just like the belts of small business. So that means they're going to emerge from this crisis with a much weaker balance sheet than they would have had this crisis not occurred. And that's going to place a continued drag on spending and consumption. And I think that's a second reason why we will not have a V-shaped recession. And also, just like I think that $350 billion for the small business sector, while that's a staggering number in raw terms, it's not that large relative to the size of the problem. I think the same can be said of the stimulus on the household side. 3 weeks of after-tax income for the median household is maybe just not that much relative to the magnitude of the problem we face. A third piece, and then I'll open it up to questions. A third piece of the story here, I think, is the retirement savings piece. And yeah, I know that everyone with a 401k that was invested in the market has lost 30% of their retirement savings over the last few weeks, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the fact, I'm going back to small business owners, and I'm talking about the fact that most small business owners, even very successful, very wealthy ones, are massively under-diversified. They have a large chunk of their overall wealth concentrated in their business. It's quite extreme. I've done some work with Angela Hung at the Rand Corporation, where we documented that there has been more than $6 billion of 401k savings that has been rolled over into new businesses over the last 10 years. The actual number is probably much higher than that, but the number that we can track is sort of conservatively estimated at around $6 billion. These are restaurants, franchises, exactly the kind of businesses that are taking a huge hit right now. We often overlook the fact that a quarter of new businesses in the economy are started by people 55 and over. So what that means then is that this retirement savings crisis is not something that's far off in the distant future. It's going to be on us right now. This pandemic is playing havoc with people's retirement plans today and in the near future, and that's going to continue to place a drag on consumption. So those are three reasons why I think that even if the employment side of it does recover quickly, that we're unlikely to see a recession that's going to end with a sharp rebound once the public health concerns subside. Now, let me open it to questions. I've got a question from an alum here in Durham who asks, do you believe that the Small Business Administration will relax the affiliation rules for small business loans so that VC and PE-backed startups will be eligible for these loans? Okay, that's a great question. Let me back up and explain the question behind the question. In order to determine your size as a business, the Small Business Administration applies what's called an affiliation rule. And that affiliation rule basically says that if two businesses have a common owner, then the sum total of employment in those two businesses is the relevant number for determining how many employees you have. Okay, so that means that if you're backed by a venture firm or private equity firm, and that private equity firm maybe has an ownership stake in 10 or 12 or 15 companies, it's the sum total employment across all those companies that matters for determining whether you're eligible for the SBA loan. I know from conversations that I've had as recently as this morning that the SBA is working to try to find a way to relax the affiliation rules so that businesses that need the money can get it. I know, it's a very delicate balancing act because they don't want to push money out there to firms that have other ways of getting that money. But general partners and private equity firms are going to start to soon face cash crunches of their own from their own limited partners. So the Small Business Administration is aware of that. And my best guess, and again, this is just a guess, my best guess is that we're going to see the SBA indeed try to make some kind of relaxation, at least temporarily, in the affiliation rules so that new businesses, venture-backed businesses, growth equity-backed businesses can be eligible for some of these proceeds. Okay, we've got a question from Dave in Philadelphia who's asking, let me see. So the question is, in order to receive a loan under the PPP plan, what obligation does a company have to bring back its entire workforce? Okay, so again, this gets in. So the way the payroll protection plan is structured, it's got some loan forgiveness built into it, and the loan forgiveness is tied to the amount of headcount that you retain at the firm. So my understanding is that if you're unable to retain your current headcount, if some of it just disappears, or if it's for whatever reason you're not able to return to that previous number, then the money that you access a greater proportion of it will have to be paid back. I think that's really the key issue here, and I guess we're going to get more guidance on this in the next few days. So that's kind of the headcount restriction there. Let's see. Let's take another question. So I know we've got a question, where can we learn to go about additional financial resources available for small businesses? So here's where I'd like to put in a plug for my colleague, Kathy Clark, who runs our Center for the Advancement of Social Entrepreneurship. She's put together a website called covidcap.com. covidcap.com is a place where if you're a small business or a nonprofit, you can go to that website and you can see a huge range of funding opportunities, grants, and various forms of relief that you may be eligible to qualify for. So please check that out to see more about additional financial resources that are available for small businesses. That's covidcap.com. Okay, let's take another question. So one question I'm seeing here is, do I think there will be additional checks sent out to households? I actually do. I think that, um, I found yesterday's news conference quite sobering. Our president has tended to stay on the optimistic side in the way they describe the likely time frame that we're operating under. But yesterday we saw a much more sobering account of exactly how long we expect this to last and exactly how dangerous we think this will be. I think you know there's an interesting space here where public health and economics uh, kind of uh, kind of butt heads against one another in a sense. There's a huge push to let people out of their houses, open restaurants, start the economy again, but that runs the risk of inviting a bounce back in infections. And if that happens, that could be catastrophic. It could not only for public health but also for the economy. So I think that we're going to be looking at a scenario where we're under protracted, significant lockdown, and that is going to stretch out. That's going to place additional pressure on households, and the only way we're going to be able to weather that is through additional checks being sent out to households. Okay, Warren in Wake Forest asks, in regard to these loans, how do you see this affecting innovation? Are these loans tied solely to employee retention and keeping the lights on? Um, these loans, um, I don't see a lot in the loan that's tied to investment in new technology and innovation. I think the way you want to think about these loans is these loans are a channel to try to keep unemployment from completely falling off a cliff. The idea is we have such a huge fraction of the workforce that works in the small business sector. Let's, just like we're throwing households a lifeline, let's throw small businesses a lifeline to try to keep those people employed as long as possible. Now, so in the short run, I don't think the effects of innovation are going to be, either positive or negative. I think people are just going to be in survival mode over the next few months. You raise an interesting question, though, about the longer term effects of this loan program on innovation. And just if you just go back to kind of your basics in corporate finance, if businesses emerge from this crisis over indebted, then that over indebtedness is going to place a drag on their investment activity, and that in turn could have a negative effect on innovation. Yes. We've got a question that asks, will loans to new ventures that directly address or mitigate pandemic issues qualify? That's a question that I'm not sure about. I'm certainly going to be paying attention to that question over the next few days as we get additional clarity. Um, I think that I think that the administration is going to do everything it can to try to stimulate economic activity among businesses that are trying to directly address these issues. So I would expect to see something there, but it's not clear to me that it's going to be operating through the PPP. Okay, let me take another question. Doesn't this all mean that we should get back to work as quickly as possible? I can tell you, I'd certainly like to get back to work as quickly as possible. I'd love to be sitting at Fuqua right now, having lunch with my colleagues and students. I think that we have to be very careful, though, because the trick here, it's as I was saying earlier, there's tension between the public health side of this crisis and the economic side of this crisis. If we get back to work too soon, we could actually have a more severe economic impact than if we just shuttered everything and the economy battened down the hatches and just waited a little longer. And the reason for this is because if we get back to work too soon and we cause a resurgence of the crisis, then that's going to slow the economy down even further, and that could drag the recovery out much further. Um, would a model like so Chibuna in New Jersey asks, would a model like paying people and businesses through this pandemic be a better option economically than having to furlough people and fire workers? I mean, we definitely want to keep people employed to the greatest extent possible. Um, and again, I think the way to look at this PPP plan that's part of the CARES Act is to see it as exactly as your question frames it. We're basically trying to pay businesses to keep people employed rather than send them into unemployment and and have to go look for a job in the midst of a recession. So I think that's exactly the logic behind the PPP as we see it. And the question is just kind of what's the optimal balance between allowing for a certain amount of unemployment to occur and preventing too much of it from happening. The jobless claims that we saw last week were staggering, 3.3 million. We've never seen anything like that, and I don't think that's the end of it. I think that we're going to see bigger claims coming going forward. Um, so there's a question. I'm seeing a question here. Do I think that a default in the in the housing market would be possible after COVID? Um, Although for these months no payment is needed and we have quantitative easing, income is going to be affected by afterwards. This is coming from Mario in Panama. I think that this is a very real concern. I mean, I definitely think that the real estate sector is going to be hit hard. The residential real estate market is going to be hammered by this. Firstly, just in the short term, we're in a situation where it's a public health risk to show your home to a potential buyer. But even when we come out from the other side of this, the continued drag on household balance sheets and on small business balance sheets is going to mean that we're going to be in this longer recessionary period, and I think that's going to have a negative impact on the housing market. I've already seen some numbers that are showing evidence that housing starts are declining rapidly. So I think that I think we're gonna see more bad news in the housing market going forward. So let's see. We've got time for one or two more questions, I think. Have I heard? Okay, so here's a question from Katie, an alumna. She asks, "Have you heard that lenders are comfortable administering the SBA loans given the number of requirements for the guarantee? This may be a premature question given that banks have not yet been given guidance." This is the question that's on every banker's mind right now. The typical process for going through the procedural hurdles for getting a loan guaranteed by the SBA's 7A program is not simple. So if this were just a normal SBA loan, I think we'd have a lot of problems. I think there'd be a huge backlog, and I think the money would take weeks and weeks and weeks to get out. Everything I'm reading, and I'm as in the dark as you are, Katie. Everything I'm reading suggests that the Treasury Secretary is trying to do everything possible to waive the requirements to make this as simple as possible loan to administer. So I'm hopeful that that additional flexibility will make banks comfortable uh, administering these loans. But I think we'll learn a lot more in the next 24 to 48 hours as we get additional guidance from the government about how this is going to work. Um, okay, so we've got a question from a current PhD student, Prab, who asks, urban density has been important in promoting innovation and entrepreneurship. Do you think there will be longer term implications from a cultural shift if COVID changes our perceptions about cities and density? That's a really interesting question. I think this experiment that we're going through right now, holding a LinkedIn Live broadcast instead of all of us gathering together in person, kind of speaks to this question in some ways. Duke has moved all of its instruction into online learning, so we're using Zoom very extensively in the classroom. This is evidence of technology being able to supplant proximity and allow people to the benefits of being close to one another without the physical closeness. So I don't know. I think it could definitely spread the playing field out. One of the things that we talk about in urban economics is we have these clusters, these hotbeds of entrepreneurial activity: San Francisco, the Triangle, the Boston area, Austin, Texas. And as these areas get increasingly expensive, new areas emerge. Boise is an area that a lot of people talk about. So what we could see is that as people embrace the new technologies for communicating, we might see that these new clusters emerge much more quickly. Several viewers are asking, how would the COVID-19 pandemic affect the job scenario for the class of 2020? Maybe this is where we should end the broadcast. I think this is a very important question. I do think that employment is going to bounce back. I just think that doesn't necessarily equate to a rapid end to a recession. I think that once we open our shutters again and start to go back into the streets, I think the economy is definitely going to pick up. I think hiring is going to return, but I think we're going to be living in a period of extended uncertainty for the next several months throughout the year. And so I do think that this could have an adverse effect on job prospects for this year's graduating class. And I'm very sorry to be saying that. And boy, I really hate to end on a down note, but we seem to be getting a lot of down notes these days. I want to tell everyone out there, please be safe. Take these restrictions seriously. Look after your loved ones. Stay healthy. Stay safe. And tune in next week, where my colleague Cam Harvey will continue the discussion. Thank you very much, and have a good day.